Hello. We're going to get started with the talk. So just real quick, as an introduction, for those of you who don't already know Scott Kennedy, and what this talk is about. So over the past 40 years, U.S. relations were built on a grand bargain that addressed the economic, strategic, and political aspects of the relationship. Commitment to that bargain has collapsed, first in Beijing and now in Washington. This talk, and Scott is going to explain the reasons for this turn in the relationship, and he's going to talk about and analyze the evolving debate in the U.S. on the broader China strategy. Just briefly, a word about Scott. He's the Deputy Director of the Freeman Chair in China Studies and Director of the Project on the Chinese Business and Political Economy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. A leading authority on China's economic policy and its global economic relations, Scott has been traveling to China for almost 30 years. He is the author of The Big Fat Tech Dragon, Benchmarking China's Innovation Drive, as well as Perfecting China, Inc., China's 13th five-year plan, and The Business of Lobbying in China. He has edited 3 books, most recently Global Governance and China, The Dragon's Learning Curve. And over 14 years, Scott was a professor at Indiana University, where he was founding director of the Research Center for Chinese Politics and Business and academic director of the university's China office. And with that, here's Scott.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you to the Hong Kong FCC for inviting me today to talk with you about U.S.-China relations. In some ways, coming to speak to you is one of the hardest things someone would do because you all are so knowledgeable. In some ways, this is like a dissertation defense. And so I have to make sure that I'm got my facts straight because you all will call me on it. But in fact, you all went one step further. You actually brought the chair of my dissertation committee here to the event, Harry Harding. So I've got 2, you're making it doubly hard for me to do that. And if there's anyone who knows anything about U.S.-China relations, it's him. So having been his student, worked for him as well, anything that I say that you agree with or you find insightful, we'll attribute it to him. Any mistakes, anything that you think are wrong, just attribute it to me, because that's really the way credit or blame should be shared today. Let me say I sort of have 3 large points that I want to make about U.S.-China relations and where we are. I want to say something about this idea of a grand bargain and what it was and why it collapsed. Then I want to say something about the short-term dynamics in the relationship, which is what we're all paying attention to today as we watch these 2 rivals compete and where it's going. And then I want to say something about the long-term trajectory of the relationship and whether or not it's possible to reconstruct this grand bargain or come up with a new grand bargain. And hopefully I'll do that in 18 minutes and then be able to have a conversation with all of you. So very simply, for me, the grand bargain that the U.S. and China had with each other was centered around a common acceptance to the liberal international order. And I may be overstating things to say that this was a grand bargain. Perhaps it was a marriage of convenience. Perhaps it was just an implicit acceptance of this. But I think thinking of it as a grand bargain is helpful. And when I emphasize the liberal international order, I mean each of the 3 parts of that phrase. Liberal, in that it encouraged market economy and good governance. And China in the 1970s, when it was trying to change course, was okay with that. It was helpful to China and to Deng Xiaoping. The international side of things was the multilateral order upon which interaction between countries and others would occur. And for China, plugging themselves into the multilateral system was incredibly important because it meant that they didn't have to deal with the U.S. just one-on-one, mano a mano, but they could participate through the UN, the GATT, the IMF, the World Bank, other institutions, and become a member of that international society. And the order part was also important. And the order was created not just by these institutions, but by American power, which defended that order. And you may think it's no surprise that the US was interested in that order, but the Chinese were okay with that order too. Because the presence of the United States in Asia and its alliance system meant that South Korea and Japan didn't need to have nuclear weapons to defend themselves against China. And so, and the US presence kept the region relatively peaceful, meant China could focus primarily on addressing its economic concerns. And so for them, it was a reasonable bargain, each of these components. Of course, for the United States, it was the way to integrate China into the system in a reasonable, hopefully peaceful way. Now, for not all Americans believe in liberal international order. A lot of Americans are just plain realists who are into measuring the relationships based on power and alliances. But for them, the liberal international order was also a convenient tool as well to try and tie the Chinese down. So both sides, the US and China, were accepting of this liberal international order for a long time. But gradually, their acceptance of this order has dissipated. First, it dissipated by China. China's decided that it's not interested in the liberal part of this order. It's not interested in rule of law. It's not interested in market economics. They are interested in deep intervention of the state in all facets of life, domestic and international. This is not something that occurred overnight. China didn't, one period, wasn't run by folks who adhere to Adam Smith or had read The End of History and thought, oh, we're going to do that too. But I would say there's gradations of differences, and under Xi Jinping, they certainly have decided that anything that looks like you're moving in the direction of a market democracy and really constraining the state is a bad idea. Now, there's sort of reasons for that that go to sort of ideological things or China's increased power. But nevertheless, it's clear that on the liberal side, the Chinese have decided that that's not for them. On the international side, the Chinese obviously like a multilateral system, but they spent many years learning the rules of the game created by the US and the West. But now the Chinese have decided that they want to rewrite a lot of those rules to go from being a rule taker to a rule maker. And they want to figure out how to essentially make the world safe for China. And a lot of those things, a lot of the rules that would make the world safe for China are a lot of the existing rules, but there are some places where the rules aren't protective enough of the authority of states. For example, to provide subsidies whenever they need it, or to control the internet and flow of information whenever they want, or to limit the flow of capital if it raises risk. And so the Chinese really have gone from trying to be students of the system to drivers of the system. And in terms of order, it seems to me that the Chinese feel that you really don't need American power in the military in Asia anymore, and that a Sino-centric world where folks pay homage to Beijing and the US has much less say in the region would be okay for them. So you could debate when these trends started, or how different it is from the past, but nevertheless, it seems to me China's essentially lost faith in this liberal international order in the new era in which Xi Jinping is in charge. At the same time, the US has also seemed to have lost faith in this liberal international order. You just have to read about news from my hometown, from Washington, D.C., I admit, It's a great town, despite all the problems it's causing for you. It's obviously actually keeping you all really well employed. I would admit that Donald Trump is right. It's helping the news business. But on the liberal side, you know Donald Trump's accusations against the media, his seeming favoritism towards strong leaders around the world, criticism of immigrants, questioning the rule of law. It doesn't seem to be high on the agenda of the United States and its foreign policy either. The international side, they've shown, the Trump administration has shown a lot of disdain for multilateralism across the board, and much prefers bilateral relations. It sees that is a much more effective way, and that the U.S. has been taken to the cleaners by everyone else because the U.S. has followed the rules while others haven't, and therefore the U.S. has big trade deficits and has been a patsy for everybody. That's the Trump administration's view. In terms of the order and military power, again, from the Trump administration's view, at least especially from the president's position, the U.S. has provided a lot to everyone and received a little in return. And that this deal needs to be reworked, and hence his hammering away on NATO countries to spend more, and his conversations about maybe the U.S. doesn't need to be in South Korea permanently or could reduce its forces, in his willingness on a lark to answer to Kim Jong-un's request to cancel the exercises with South Korea. So the U.S., at least under the Trump administration, is questioning this order as well. And to some extent, it is sort of an ideological shift that reflects the idiosyncrasies of the Trump administration and the president. But I would say that this has been building up for a long time, that lots of American politicians and others have pointed to the rising U.S. trade deficit with China. A lot of people believe that letting China into the WTO was a fool's errand, and that they thought there would be this soothing scenario where everything would work out, and look, we actually didn't get the market democracy that we would hope for, and that patient integration was a strategy that wouldn't work, and that the U.S. needed to try something different. So there is something particular to the way the Trump administration is prosecuting, has lost faith in this order, but there's a larger view out there that's bubbling up about about these problems. Of course, he's put his spin on it and his approach, and today we are looking at the news for the possibility of an additional tariffs coming, which I totally expect. Part of them today, more over the coming weeks, and Chinese retaliation, and then potentially keep on going. So this tension that we have in the loss of faith in this order on both sides, to some extent, you might say it's like the Thucydides trap. I think I prefer to call it the Xi-Trump trap. You have hardliners on both sides, have very particular views about their countries and the world order and where they fit, and that is really putting a strain on this relationship, which is so important globally. Let me say something about the short-term dynamics. I think in the Trump administration, there's been a spectrum shift about how to deal with China over the last year or so. I think you had at the early part of the Trump administration a conversation between those who wanted to put some pressure on China in the hope that China would increase its imports, make some modest concessions on foreign investors in China, on the one hand, and the other hand, those who wanted to push for structural reforms, who wanted China to constrain industrial policy, made in China 2025 and were willing to really ramp up pressure on China quite significantly. That debate's over, and there's a new debate in the administration, which I think really started in late May and continued through July 6th when the U.S. First implemented tariffs. The other side of the debate now is that the U.S. is not in a negotiation with China, that it's not trying to get something from China, that's a fool's errand, that China could do nothing that would really satisfy the United States because of who they're run by. And in fact, what we are doing is in the beginning processes of building a wall against China, of disengaging, of isolating China, of containing China, of deterring China, and that the small steps, the steps that you've seen so far are just the first parts of these are not temporary things from these folks' point of view. These are permanent policies that are going to be in place and followed by many more policies, each which will build this wall higher and higher. That's the debate that's occurring right now. This debate isn't resolved, and we don't know exactly who's on top, because both sides favor the exact same tools right now. Both sides are totally comfortable with unilateral brinksmanship right now. So I'd put Lighthizer in the camp of those who would take a deal if you got serious structural reform, and Navarro and others from the Pentagon who think that there's no deal that you could make with China. And so that's really what the debate is in Washington right now, as I see it. On the Chinese side, there's been some debate in Beijing and in China as a whole, but I think the consistent strategy that China has taken since the Trump administration's come into office and before, because it was their game book before, their playbook before, is to figure out what's the lowest possible price to make all this go away. To be reactive to American actions and suss out what they could do to solve this problem. First, this focused on making friends with the president's family members, and then when that didn't work, making friends with the president, and then when that didn't work, turning their attention to other types of possibilities that would bring the U.S. back to the negotiating table. And so there's these several things that the Chinese keep asking about. Will the Republicans lose the House at the midterms? Well, maybe that will make Trump want to negotiate. Will the tariffs cause the New York Stock Exchange and financial markets to go down? Oh, well, that will bring Trump to the negotiating table. Will the Russia investigation yield something to make the president need some kind of short-term victory and bring the Trump administration to accept a lot less? And now we've got the famous op-ed, right? And the signs of chaos in the administration and the weakness of the administration. I think that just emboldens the Chinese to wait even more, to say, these buffoons will eventually take a deal. And so it looks like this is the direction the Chinese are moving in. I don't see really any significant signs that the Chinese are softening their position or considering any other real significant change in their strategy. And if they're wrong in the short term, well, presidents change. There'll be an election in 2020. So maybe things will turn out better then. So I think we've got in the short term this dynamic of hardliners on both sides feeling pretty strong in their positions and pretty fixed, and the dynamics between the two sides encouraging the other to continue in their positions. And that's why I think it's just interesting that in all the conversations that I have in Hong Kong or when I'm in Washington, there's been this 180-degree flip-flop amongst the commentariat. I was convinced over a year ago that the U.S. was going to go forward with tariffs and try and squeeze China. And very few people believed me. And I remember on one of my trips to China this year in Shanghai, the businessmen and women telling me, that's crazy. Why would the U.S. shoot themselves in the foot? It's so important to them, right? And so no one was believing that Trump would go through it. He's a bluffer, he's a deal maker, blah, 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 blah. And today, now it's Thucydides' trap, new Cold War. It will never end. We're just going to, we might as well just start nuking each other, right? I was just over at the AmCham China conference, and just the feeling of inevitability just seems to be super widespread. And I think there's reasons why that's justified, but I don't think it's guaranteed. And so I don't want to be overly optimistic, but maybe I'll be a little bit idealistic for a little bit, at least to spur conversation. Because as someone who works in a think tank, my job is to provoke and prod, even if I'm being a crazy about it. I won't go overboard though. So over the long term, what I see happening is that the U.S. has gone from a policy for many years of patient integration. Basically, they thought the goal was to integrate China into the system, be patient about it, use bilateral negotiation, multilateral institutions, and patiently allow China the space to adapt. And Trump has run to the opposite end of the spectrum. He's now embraced impatient isolation and pressure on China. The very opposite. Now, the question is there some other alternatives out there? I think it's pretty unlikely, even though the Chinese hope, that Trump or any other Republican or Democrat would go back to patient integration with China and just using the old institutions that we had. But there are some other possible outcomes. I think the most likely outcome is that Democrats or some other Republican that could replace the president would accept Trump's his goals, but use different tools to get there. That they would decide, you know what, this relationship isn't going to work out. We need to isolate China, but not in the chaotic way that the Trump administration is doing. That instead, we need to do it in a much more organized way. We need to take all those liberal countries on one side and take all those illiberal dictatorships and put them outside the system. So rebuild the liberal international order by kicking out all those bad apples. I think that's pretty likely because Trump has basically forced the conversation in a direction which says it's really hard to make any deal with these guys. I think where the alternative of this, where I would prefer it go, would be to show a little bit more comfort with Trump's tools and tactics, but toward the old goal of integration. So what I would call sort of impatient, sort of strong-armed integration with China. That is, try and rebuild this liberal international order, but use some sharp elbows when needed, and give the Chinese a choice. You can join the system, and you can negotiate new rules where there are no rules, or try to meet your obligations where you're not meeting them, and we'll rewrite these rules together if needed. But where you break the rules, we're going to be tough. We're not going to be endlessly impatient. We'll file more WTO cases. We'll treat your companies as you're treating our companies in China. Introduce some of the reciprocity principles, which the Trump administration talked a lot about in 2017, but you don't hear much now. And I think that has a chance of success. And the reason I think it has a chance of success is because there is political space in the United States for a more assertive, aggressive integration approach. If you believe the president and those that follow him, America has lost out because of globalization, and that in between California on the left and the East Coast on the right, you have a whole lot of old white racist men with no jobs sitting on their porch complaining about the rest of the world. That's not true. 70% of Americans still support globalization, and in fact, the poll numbers have gone up lately. And so the big data shows that actually there's still huge support for constructive American engagement of the global economy and the international system. And the anecdotal evidence shows the same thing. I would really encourage all of you to look at a new book by James Fallows and his wife Deb Fallows called Our Towns. A terrific book. It's really thick, it's heavy, it's weighing me down as I go on this trip, but it is fantastic. It shows you that small and medium-sized towns in America have adapted to globalization. They've already actually faced that, and many of them have done extremely well. There's problems in the United States, but in fact, a lot of America is doing well. And there is, outside of Washington and Beijing, support for a relationship which is a little bit more hard-headed and realist, but still promotes integration. And I think actually if you did the same thing, if you went into China and you went outside Beijing and you talked to Chinese business people and students and hospitals and retirees, you'd find plenty of support for a China that wasn't going in the direction that it seems to be going in now. So I do think that there's a social, economic foundation for continuing this relationship. So I rarely give advice to folks in Beijing in terms of what they should do. But just to wrap this up, if I had any advice for Xi Jinping and the folks in Beijing, my suggestion would be stop thinking about where China ought to go in the future in the context of U.S.-China relations. Stop making your policies about the future of the country dependent on reacting to what the U.S. is doing. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping didn't decide he was going to reform the country because he negotiated with the United States market opening measures and the allowing of private property. He looked around the world, looked especially at his neighborhood, and saw that there was a different way that China needed to go. And in 1991, when China, just after Tiananmen, was facing a lot of economic hardships and isolation, Deng Xiaoping decided to go on the southern tour and restart economic reforms and liberalization. So he didn't need a negotiation with the Bush administration to do that. He just decided to do it. So my suggestion for Xi Jinping is just do it. Follow the Nike slogan. If you want to reform your economy, if you want to make it more successful, you don't have to spend a minute on an airplane going to Washington or staying in a Washington hotel or eating bad Washington food. You can just decide to reform your economy. Take the third plenum reforms and really implement them. Take the Boao speech promises and really go forward with them. And in November, when you make your big speech on the 40th anniversary of the reform era, have a lot of meat in there and roll it out. Don't wait for Washington. And if you did that, you'd find a lot of domestic support, plus you'd find a lot of support in Europe, in Japan, in the region, in ASEAN, and actually a lot of folks in the United States, maybe not in the Trump administration, but what better way to turn the tables on the Trump administration than for China to be the defender of the liberal international order? I think that would be a smart policy. Now, are they going to take my suggestion? Maybe not, but I'm a think tanker, so I'll hope against hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott, for a fascinating talk. We're going to jump into questions now. So I'm going to get started with one, since I have the advantage of the microphone. You talked a lot from the DC perspective, but I wonder if you could just flip sides to the Beijing perspective now. And given what we've, I think, all read now, excerpts from Bob Woodward's book, I'm thinking particularly about the Gary Cohn taking papers off of Trump's desk to protect NAFTA and South Korea trade deals. For a second, can you put on your Beijing cap and tell me, like, how do you think Beijing is dealing with that information? And does that change their calculation with the trade war and, step by step, what they do next?
I think that the Chinese watching the United States have gotten a lot better over the years. They understand American politics a lot better than they used to. They also understand just enough to get it really wrong and to be overconfident. And they certainly have done that with the Trump administration. And I think there should be a lot of internal conversations in China about how everybody got Trump wrong. Partly they came and talked to us, right? We told them Clinton would win, and they went home and said Clinton will win, and then we said Clinton would win and stuff. So they had to get out of D.C. when they come to Washington, right, and stop going to places like CSIS. On the other hand, I also think that the job that the folks talking to Xi Jinping have was very difficult. I thought it was going to be really hard for them to explain to him the Steele report and all the stuff in there. But I think this is going to be even harder. But I think the result is for the Chinese to decide that making a deal with these folks is just really not in the cards. You might be able to pull one over on him, but really it's really unlikely. So just hold out until he decides that until Trump decides that he needs something from China, a deal. And so I think it just makes them more resolved. They have a lot more faith in their system to stick this out. Of course, the Trump administration has the opposite view. When Larry Kudlow, the economic advisor, at a meeting a few weeks ago in response to a question from Trump about how the Chinese economy is doing, saying it's doing horrible, we're winning. You know, I think there are a lot of folks in the Trump administration that really feel they're winning because by the way they keep score, anxiety in Beijing is going up. So I think the revelations just make the Chinese want to dig in more.
Thank you. Okay. Oh, go ahead.
Thank you, Scott. Julian Strongarmed, various affiliations, I'll say the University of Sussex here. I have a point I'd like to ask clarification on. When you refer to China, you say the state. I thought China was a political party that had a state. When you use the word state, do you mean the Chinese Communist Party? And then I have a question about the US approach to handling China in regard to the WTO. China, from a US perspective, has failed to abide by its commitments that it made in return for accession to the WTO. It promised to reform its economy in various structural ways, including the implementation of trade courts, independent trade courts. None of this has happened. The US could go to the WTO and lodge a complaint on that basis, and that would have an impact on China's membership of the WTO. And you partly answered this later in your talk, but how bipartisan in the US is the desire to disengage with China?
On the first good question, and I think China specialists, we overgeneralize because it's just easier, but I meant the party state. You know, by convenience, a lot of times you'll refer to Xi Jinping as president, but he's also party's general secretary. The party state in China, I think, has been undergoing a lot of transformations that we're still trying to figure out. But you know, the party is seems to me, playing a more direct role in setting of policy. In part through these leading small groups, of which Xi Jinping, I think, is the head of 7 or 8 of them. But usually, you know, it's just a synonym for regime or something. I don't mean to ignore the Communist Party. In terms of the U.S. and the WTO, you know, I think there's general frustration because there was an expectation when China joined in 2001 that 15 years hence or longer, you know, China would have a more market-oriented economy. And, you know, I would say, you know, there was some reason to be modestly hopeful that the WTO wasn't turning China into a full market economy, but the WTO was good enough speed bump to slow the Chinese down and make compliance good enough or acceptable enough. I think what's happened is, you know, global financial crisis, Snowden, other factors have persuaded the Chinese that government intervention to promote high tech and move up the value-added chain and control that supply chain value-added chain is really, really important. And then in addition to, so really not paying as much attention to the WTO rules as before. And secondly, the Chinese have a lot more outward investment, which they didn't have in 2001. So the question, you know, there is no World Investment Organization. The WTO's rules on investment are very thin. So at the time, there was no worries or even thought that, ooh, you know, we've got an unequal situation and we need them to comply. But now that you've got all this Chinese investment abroad, you're now recognizing that there's this big gap in the global system. So how do you resolve that? Personally, I'd like to use the sort of impatient integration strategy. And I think you'd find a lot of support for that. But I think the longer Trump is pursuing this impatient disengagement strategy, the harder it's going to be for what you would call Rockefeller Republicans, business-oriented Republicans, and Democrats to really push hard against him. And so I think the political logic of D.C., not the United States as a whole, but of Washington, reduces their courage to take a position which I think is defensible. It's a little more complicated to defend, so I'm concerned that we will have concluded that trying to use the rules of the game or build new rules of the game isn't going to work.
Okay, over there.
It's just picking up on what you just said about sort of, let's say, sort of the Rockefeller Group or the multinationals in the United States. Do you think there's any way that China can drive a wedge between the US administration and to use the US multinationals to gain more leverage over what Trump does, or is that just a strategy that's not going to work? And allied to that, is there any chance that if that then doesn't work, China would use non-tariff barriers directly against large US multinationals that manufacture in China, such as they did against Japanese and Korean firms?
Sure. I think U.S. multinationals are primarily in one location right now, which is under the table. They are not a political force in D.C. or Beijing. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce came out with a statement as part of the 301 hearings a couple weeks ago, 17-page statement, criticizing tariffs, but only a single sentence on what the U.S. should do instead. And so very few companies are actually coming out with an alternative game plan for the U.S. And none of them are going up to Beijing to say, this is justified, and you guys need to change. Sometimes they'll do that in private. There have been some audiences with Wang Qishan and some others where they've tried to consistently say that it's not just Trump, that this is there's a broader problem. But they are not telling the Chinese that if China doesn't fix things, they'll walk with their feet and go someplace else, which is the real power that business has. So I see business playing a much more backseat role in this conflict. Trump administration, at least the folks who are in the camps wanting structural reform, who don't want it, who think change is impossible, they don't even want to offer time to business, and they think that those folks are out for themselves, but not for the national interests of the United States. So it seems unlikely that they're going to play a huge role, at least right now.
Okay, we'll go over to this side of the room first.
Hi, I'm Jeff Nackabell, the Consul General of Canada, and Scott, we met before in Beijing years ago. Scott, you've written a lot about business lobbying, about the kind of big business community in China and its interaction with government policy, with party policy over the years. And I wonder if you could say anything about where has been the voice of the Chinese big business community within China towards Beijing on the developments that you've been talking about.
Sure. Good to see you again. My sense is, in terms of the Chinese industry, yes, there's lobbying in China. It occurs all the time by Chinese and foreign companies. It still goes on. There's a lot more attention on the party now as an institution, as your target. But still mostly narrow bore issues, things that are bread and butter for the companies, specific regulatory issues that matter, from individual licenses that you may need to specific types of industrial and tax policy. So that's those things are still ongoing. But Chinese also know how far they can push and how far they shouldn't push. So you can push for some type of regulatory industrial policy change, but you're not going to be, screaming from the heights, about that, reform and opening is long gone, and geez, I really hope it comes back. I wrote a piece about 6 or 7 years ago, having spent some time in Zhejiang, which is the heart of private business in China. And I titled the article "Pink Capitalists," because most Chinese companies have to make peace with the political system in which they live. And I think that is, and they do that in a variety of different ways. It means bringing party members and families onto your board. It means joint ventures with SOEs. It means helping the state in other ways, being members of the National People's Congress or the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference or local of them, and not acting up too much. And if you don't want to, follow the lead of Beijing, you must at least do so. You must do what you're doing quietly, and then try and frame what you're doing as consistent with what Beijing would like. And so I think, to some extent, you're seeing, a lot of trends in company activity, which isn't just following Made in China 2025, although there's a lot of money out there right now. But Chinese companies have been investing in robotics for a long time, and AI, and many of these other things, and the Chinese government itself has just turned in their direction. But there's this need to have this symbiotic relationship with either the central party state, make sure I include, or the local, or both. And so that limits, and how many Chinese companies, I bet you if you went to their websites, and how many would say that they're doing Belt and Road projects right now? Probably gajillions of them. Now, are they really doing Belt and Road projects? Are they really inspired by a Xi Jinping speech about this? Probably not.
We have time for 2 more questions. So you over there, table 3.
Ken Chang from Redwood Peak. Thanks for your comments. You were mentioning the possibility that this impatient disengagement may not work itself out for people who are trying to work through the WTO and through normal channels. Is there a chance that, given, I guess, the perceived optics of China's escalation in the Paracel Islands or South China Sea, One Belt, One Road, that there's enough paranoia that an accident happens in the South China Sea where essentially the Allied group of forces just bombs what they don't recognize as China, and we get a royal mess?
I'm not a super expert on the South China Sea and the security relationship, but from what I know, particularly drawing on the work of my colleagues like Bonnie Glazer and others at CSIS, the chances of some accident like that occurring is really, really low. The level of visibility of what both sides are doing is extremely high. It's so high that we have a website dedicated to it called the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, where you can go to CSIS's website and look at how these the militarization of the islands and everything that's going on. I think there's lots of transparency. So if something is going to occur, if there's going to be an incident, it's going to be intentional. I don't think the U.S. and its allies want that. So the FONOPs are really meant to make a point, not to result in a conflict. I don't think that if something does occur, then I would really look at, there must be some broader plan behind it, not just some mistake.
Okay, one last question at the front here.
Hi, Scott. Dan Strumpf at the Wall Street Journal. I was just wondering, you mentioned earlier that there's been this hardening among policymakers in Washington in terms of how to deal with China on trade. And just given that there's another very large round of tariffs likely right now from the U.S., I mean, how much further can the U.S. go in terms of pushing China? What other tools are in the toolkit, be it more tariffs or other tools, and how much further do you see that going?
Yeah. You would think of Washington's a really boring place with no creative people, but my God, they are creative. I was thinking of lots of really amazing things that they might do to China. So first of all, you can you can raise the tariffs across the board for every tariff line. You can then try and kick China out of the WTO and raise tariffs to the non-MFN level. Or you can withdraw from the WTO and do the same thing. You can radically restrict Chinese investment, direct investment, portfolio investment, limit visas for Chinese students, which for some universities it's the lifeblood of the university now and their profit stream. When I taught at Indiana University in 2000 when I started, I think there were a couple dozen undergraduate students from China. By the time I left, there were 3,500 Chinese on the campus out of 40-some thousand, that's a lot. You really needed to know Mandarin to get your way around. And I think you've just got, if you look at every different way in which we have this interwoven web between the United States and China, you could see them trying to pick those things apart. We're still very, very early in the game of disengagement. Chimerica is a rich, deep, wide economy, and with people-to-people links of many kinds. So actually fully implementing that, there's a long way to go, but there's some creative people. Again, I think there may be off-ramps to this, but we're going to, I think, do a few more difficult things to raise the pressure on Beijing, and then in reverse before there's a serious conversation in either place about that.
Okay, well, thank you very much for a really interesting debate and discussion. Before we leave, we have a little gift for you. No surprises what it is.
Okay.